Welcome to another of our online reflection for learning activities. This one's on reflective practice experiments, which is a phrase that comes from Donald Schoen's work. You'll find a good discussion of it in his book, Educating the Reflective Practitioner. And this is a little experiential exercise that you can do with students to introduce them to some of the key differentiations that Schoen makes when he's describing different kinds of reflective practice experiments. And what Schoen differentiates is what he calls exploratory practice, where you're just practicing with curiosity and awareness and thoughtfulness, and you're seeing what happens and seeing what you can learn from that. Move testing, which is where you think, oh, it might be interesting to try such and such. Let's see how that works. And then hypothesis testing, where you're thinking, oh, if I do such and such, I think so and so will happen. And that's kind of a useful differentiation because it makes a contrast along a trajectory of feeling like you don't have any expectations or much to say yet about what might happen, through to at the other end thinking, oh, okay, I think if I do X, Y will happen. And in the middle, there's kind of like, oh, I can see a few possibilities here. Let's see what happens as I try each of those. So if you're going to do that in a teaching context, I'd strongly encourage you to ask everybody to be kind of careful and safe and really look after themselves. So this is not meant to be an invitation to do things that are a bit too scary. And I'll just mention that I've used this amongst other things in helping students to learn negotiation skills. And if you think about it, negotiation is a place where if you pick the wrong negotiation or if you're unexpectedly unskillful, things can go badly wrong. And so I scaffold people to be very gentle and cautious in their processes, and to be very ready to just change track and take things nice and easy if something like that does happen. But our little exercise is going to be very, very much gentler and simpler than this, and you can do it in any kind of classroom space or sitting at a desk or whatever. So let's give it a go. It involves basically just playing with your fingers and your hand. So to begin, just find yourself a comfortable way to let your elbow rest on something and let your arm stand up straight, something like that. So any version of that. So you sort of make yourself comfortable so you can play with your fingers of one or both hands. We'll start with one hand. So when you're comfortable, I just want you to do something extremely simple, which is an example of exploring as you're practicing. So just wiggle your fingers gently, paying close attention to how the wiggling feels. So notice what it feels on the inside in your hand. Notice what the moving feels like. You can look at your hand if you like. This is exploratory practice. You're just wiggling your fingers and seeing what that's like. So that's a very simple example of saying, okay, there's this thing we can do. We can wiggle our fingers. Let's pay close, sensitive, curious attention to it and see what we notice. So now let's try a move testing example. So in move testing, you're looking for things that you could try out that seem promising. You think, oh, if I do that, that might be helpful. And there are lots of ways you can wiggle your fingers. So let me mention a few. They might pick up some that wouldn't have occurred to you just doing the exploratory practice. So on each of your fingers, you've got 3 joints that you can wiggle from: your actual fingertips joint, the middle joint in your finger, and then the joint where your finger joins your hand. So that's 3 different places where your fingers can be wiggled from. And you can move them separately. So you can move one finger to play with one finger on its own, or 2 fingers, or 3, or 4, or 5, including your thumb, or we can do the whole lot. So you can play with them separately. You can involve your whole hand, for example, moving your hand, thumb and finger back across your whole hand, or making a fist and opening up all the way. And you can use either hand, your main hand, your dominant hand, or your non-dominant, or both. So that's a whole repertoire of possible ways of moving, and I'm sure we could think of more if we spent more time on it. So for this little move testing experiment, just have a look at that list of possibilities and think, okay, which ones am I curious about? And find, you know, one or two of those. And if you have time, you can do another one that you're curious about seeing how it works. So working with the finger joints, fingers together or separately, involving your whole hand, either hand or both. Just spend a little time doing some move testing and just see what you notice about what it's like to wiggle your fingers when you're doing some particular moves that you're curious about. So take your time to explore a couple of moves, maybe some additional ones if you want to. So any situation you find yourself in, you'll find that there are different kinds of moves that you could play with. And you can see already that just something as simple as moving your hands can unfold into a whole lot more complex possibilities that might first occur to you. So now let's try what Shane calls hypothesis testing, which is, I think if I do X, then Y might happen. And we're going to take our example from something that comes from Feldenkrais's practice in movement. And Feldenkrais spent a lot of time getting people to do moves that they would normally do in much smaller and much slower ways than we ordinarily do them, so that we can pay a lot more attention to how we do what we do. And in the process, one of the things that he pointed out and that you often notice is that there's a kind of surprising fine-grained sort of jerkiness in the moving that you wouldn't have otherwise expected to find there. And quite a lot of his exercises are designed to help you become more fluid and more relaxed in the way you move. But we're going to just take that first insight and try it as a hypothesis testing experiment. So now you're going to be moving your fingers very slowly, very, very slowly, and looking for a fine-grained jerkiness, sort of the absences of smoothness in the movement. And let's see how we go exploring Feldenkrais's hypothesis here. So moving your fingers very, very slowly so that you're in a position to notice just very slight accelerations and decelerations and pauses and shifts in the flow of moving. It can be extremely slow. I'm actually doing it at the moment. It might be so slow you can't see that I'm moving. So feel free to go super duper slow if you want to. So you're really taking time to explore Feldenkrais's intuitional understanding of how moving is and the ways in which fluidity and kind of disruptions kind of can play in our experience. And when you feel ready, I'd just like you to relax and just step back a little from experimenting in all these three different ways. And just notice your hand, wiggle your fingers gently, just paying close attention to how being a hand feels, and see if you can notice any differences now from how it was before and how it was at the end. That's a kind of Feldenkraisian move for checking in to see what's different afterwards. So now I'll give a bit of space to anybody who'd like to kind of comment on their experience. Or not, as the case may be. We don't have to comment. So let me just recheck. Does anybody like to say anything? If not, I'll just say a few more framing comments. And for anybody listening who's teaching, feel very relaxed about whether or not people speak up or not. There's actually a learning that goes on in the doing, and that's actually what the center of this is. So let me make a couple of comments then. So Shane differentiates these three different kinds of experimenting. He calls them all versions of reflective practice experiments. They don't have to be done separately. In professional practice, they can often be combined, sort of they hybridize. But it's useful because it helps unpack the process of practicing thoughtfully and learning as you're practicing, which is learning about what you're doing. And it kind of opens up the sense of multiple possibilities, which range from the very, very gentle exploratory practice through to the kind of feeling quite informed hypothesis testing, but with this kind of curious opportunity in the middle of thinking, oh, okay, that might work. Let's do a bit of it and see what happens. And I've used this model with teaching people systems analysis in environmental, socio-ecological systems analysis with environmental students, teaching them stakeholder analysis to tune them into political thinking, teaching management systems analysis for management system design, creative thinking practices, negotiation, as I mentioned earlier on, and reflective practice itself. And it's proved a fruitful scaffold for helping people find their way into being conscious of how they do what they do and learning to do these things more skillfully and intentionally. And it's a very, very useful thing to do from the point of view of helping people develop skills in managing their own ongoing learning. So if you want students to leave your classes not merely having learnt what you've been teaching them, the skills and the knowledge, but also empowered to go and change what they do ongoingly in their professional lives, teaching this kind of reflective practice experiments stuff is very, very helpful. So in my case, I've had students do things like, well, an example, one student who was working in a pub in Sydney, where we all are, working out how to change water management in the pub because he was worried about the amount of water that was being wasted. And so he did stakeholder analysis and principal negotiation to work out how to talk to his boss about alternative possibilities. So it's quite a useful thing from the point of view of developing professional practice. So, and so there's more about this kind of practice in our Reflection for Learning guide, which Marina, you can, there we go. This particular practice is a new practice, so it's not there yet, but hopefully it'll be in the second edition. But you get a lot of interesting information about Reflection for Learning from this guide. It's available free from Advanced HE. And if you try this out and you'd like to give us some feedback, we'd love to hear. Email us at this email address, reflection4lc@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening.